Today I want to talk about Syngoniums. I feel like it is a genus within the aroid family that is kind of underrated, even though they make great houseplants. So today I want to give Syngoniums a little bit of love and show you my collection. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I have surrounded myself with the majority of my Syngonium collection. I walked around my house and garden and I could only find 7, but 2 of them are planted in the ground, so I can't take them inside with me. So I have surrounded myself with these 5, and funnily enough, all 5 of them actually came from my garden or greenhouse. I didn't do that on purpose, to be honest, but quite clearly I have the tendency to put my Syngoniums outside. But we're gonna talk about why that is in a second, because they are actually quite hardy plants. I wanted to start off with more general information about the genus in itself. So it's a genus within the Araceae family, aka an aroid. So they're in the same family as philodendron, anthuriums, alocasias, lomatophyllums, and so on. They are native to tropical rainforests in the south of Mexico, the West Indies, as well as Central and South America. The center of diversity for the species is Costa Rica and Panama. Costa Rica has 13 Syngonium species and Panama has 11. Mexico has 8. They are vining plants that like to grow up trees, and they go through significant changes in leaf size and shape when maturing. Obviously there's differences between species, but most of them develop very distinct lobes when they mature. They are a very popular houseplant, but most of the time when we grow them as houseplants, we actually grow the juvenile form, and that's pretty much what I've surrounded myself with as well. Apart from the Styromarchii that has matured a little bit. Most of the time Syngoniums are grown for their juvenile form. That's when they, in my personal opinion, have the nicest leaf shape, but also when they have the nicest features when it comes to colors, variegation, and so on. The most cultivated species of Syngonium is Syngonium podophyllum, and I have 2 examples to my right over here. But there are so many cultivars and varieties out there in all sorts of colors. Alrighty, that's a little bit about the history of Syngoniums. Now, based on that history and where they're native to, we know that they love a tropical environment. Now, a tropical environment doesn't always have to be hot. A tropical environment can also be cold if it's at higher elevation. We've got Syngonium Styromarchii over here, for example, that is actually native to regions above 1,250 meters in height. Hence, it would be much cooler where this plant grows, for example. So obviously within this genus there's variety, but bottom line is that they are tropical plants. So they do appreciate warmer temperatures, they appreciate a high humidity environment, and they appreciate consistent watering, let's say. But most of the time when we're growing these plants, we're actually not growing them to get them to maturity, we're actually growing them to be juvenile. So I think it's one of these genus where we're not actually aiming for the plant to fully thrive to its full potential, because we are kind of trying to avoid maturity often to keep nice features. And I think that in itself makes it a great houseplant. We're not aiming for maturity. We're happy for the plant to continuously stay juvenile. So we don't necessarily need to meet the perfect conditions for these plants. I actually think that Syngoniums are great houseplants because they are tolerant to a variety of conditions. They're much hardier than an anthurium or an alocasia, for example. Before we look into all of them individually a little bit more, they all get very similar treatment. They're all in my chunky aroid mix, which is mainly bark, cocoa chips, perlite, pumice, bit of tree fern fiber or cocoa peat for water retention, but overall definitely they love the aeration of my chunky aroid mix. Now 3 of them are on poles. All of the poles are actually filled with aroid mix. That is not necessarily because the plant prefers the aroid mix over moss. I have previously also grown them in moss and the plant had a field day. That is actually because they're all growing outdoors, and I have a much easier time watering these plants outdoors with the hose when they're just in aeroid mix. So they're in aeroid mix in the pot as well as within the pole, and the plant is loving it. Syngoniums have fairly chunky roots even when they're juvenile, so they really appreciate the chunky mix, but they also tolerate a decent level of drying out, let's say. They're all being fed with my normal nutrient solution, GT Foliage Focus. However, because they all grow outdoors, I'm not as consistent with it as I am indoors, because majority of the time the watering outdoors is just done either by rain or by me hosing them down. So I don't provide them with as many nutrients as they probably would like, but I'm also not necessarily aiming for maturity with them in the first place, so it's not a bad thing. When it comes to pests, the podophyllums are actually pretty decent. I don't think I've ever really had any pest issues with them. I'm trying to think back, probably spider mites at some stage. The Styramarchii is definitely a spider mite candidate, but since I have been growing it outdoors, it has also been pretty fine. Red Arrow Syngonium down here, the little one, it is a little bit behind in growth because I had to fully chop it back. It had a crazy aphid infestation last year. So those are the only two pests I have encountered with Syngoniums over the course of four-ish years of growing some of them. So again, compared to Anthuriums, Alocasias or Philodendrons, specifically velvet ones, even Monsteras, I feel like Monsteras always have thrips. They don't seem to be a crazy pest magnet. Now, me growing most of them outdoors might also help with pests because they obviously frequently get washed down by the rain, by the hose, and there's also natural predators out there. But me growing them outdoors also means that they are exposed to a variety of conditions, and that comes back to what I said earlier. My conditions in my garden are not tropical, definitely not year-round. However, the plants still survive. I have to admit, it is the first year for the Styramarchii in my garden. It is the first year for the Frosted Heart in my greenhouse. It used to be in my IKEA cabinet, and it's the first year for the Mojito in the garden as well. So those three have actually not gone through a winter out there. However, the other two have. Now, this one suffered during winter because of the aphids, not necessarily because of the cold. There was no harm to the root system as a result of the cold. Outdoors, it can definitely go down to like 2 degrees was the coldest, but it was only one day. 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius at nighttime are not necessarily a surprise or are not unique over the cooler months. So definitely far from the normal minimum of 16 that I would consider for tropical plants. The variegated over here, the Podophyllum Valgada, Albo Valgada Fantasy, whatever you want to call it, was also in my greenhouse all year round as well as over winter, and it also hardly suffered at all actually. It was still growing. And this Styramarchii, actually, I have seen a really beautiful specimen of that at the Botanic Gardens over here in Sydney, and it grows outdoors year-round, as well as many, many other Syngonium species. So I know that they can tolerate the Sydney weather, even during winter. It is just the first season for them, but the plan is for all of them to actually stay outside during the upcoming autumn and then winter as well. So if they can survive outside in Sydney's winter, they can definitely survive indoors. I would assume that our indoor conditions hardly ever drop below, I would even say 20 degrees. I think maybe 15 sometimes, but in general for a healthy temperature for humans is 20 degrees Celsius indoors. So I'm assuming that we're keeping our house healthy for our own sake, and 20 degrees Celsius is perfectly fine for these sort of plants. I think when it comes to humidity, the Styramarchii might be the only one that's a little bit finicky. All the other ones don't really seem to be too fussed from my experience. They are quite thick and have nice glossy leaves, so I think lower humidity ranges shouldn't be a huge issue, but I think at 50% humidity or so, you should have plenty of success growing Syngoniums. Alrighty, that's kind of the general stuff about Syngoniums at large. Of course, keep in mind that I'm talking about a whole genus with many different species within it, from a fairly large region that they are native to, right? And within that region you have many different climate zones and so on as well. So of course there's differences, but also we need to keep in mind that a lot of these plants have been in cultivation for a very long time. So these specific specimen, right, they didn't come from their native environment and I took them out of it and chucked them into my house or garden, right? They have been cultivated for many years now, decades, maybe even centuries, and I think they have somewhat built resilience to being ornamental plants. At least that's kind of like what I figured using common sense. Anyway, let's have a look at some of these species. Let's start off with the podophyllums because I think they are like the, they're the popular one. That's what kind of everybody thinks of when we think of Syngonium. Because of the podophyllum, I think they're often also referred to as arrowhead plants because you can see the podophyllum has beautiful, nice arrowheads. Now, this is the leaf form when it's juvenile, and this one is the mojito variety or cultivar, a cultivated variety, I'm not too sure. You can see it has stunning variegation, especially over here in these newer leaves. I think that looks so nice. And then eventually the variegation kind of just fades and they're more green. Now this one, oh my god, what is happening here? I've made a full video on this plant recently, right? Because this is a great example of me keeping the plant juvenile to maintain the variegation in the juvenile leaves and to maintain the arrow-shaped leaf shape. If I would allow this to climb, it would mature and the leaf shape would change. It would become, it would have I think 3 lobes first, eventually 5, and it would also lose the mojito variegation, which I suppose you grow this variety for. So to keep it juvenile, I consistently chop it up. Like you can see over here, pretty much every single vine has been chopped many times, propagated, and then the propagations have been put back into the pot so that I have so many shoots in here now, right? And that, to be honest, is my recommendation with majority of the podophyllum. You most likely get a podophyllum for the variegation, for the colors, right? There's so much variety in that species. They have really beautiful pinks and reds, and the tricolor is beautiful. Whichever one of those you pick up, I always recommend that you grow them juvenile. So go for quantity rather than quality actually. Oh well, the quantity will preserve the quality as well. So I have decided to not give them a moss pole so that they don't mature. I have 2 other podophyllum types that are outside. One of them is the confetti. It's really nice and white and has nice cute little pink dots in it, and the 3 kings, that's kind of like green, white, variegated as well. Both of them are just in the garden bed, of course, because they're in the garden bed, they've also been out there year round. They're also not sheltered in a greenhouse or anything, and they're just perfectly fine. They don't thrive during winter, but they also they hardly even die back, right? And then obviously in summer, they have a bit of a growth spurt. So no matter your taste, I'm sure you'll find a Syngonium podophyllum that you like. My recommendation would be to create a nice lush horizontal display by continuously propagating rather than aiming for maturity with this. Now, one of them that I kind of have aimed for maturity with is my Fantasy. At least that's what we call this variety over here in Australia. It is Podophyllum albo variegata. It's basically a white variegated podophyllum. And you can see this is sort of the leaf shape, when juvenile, which I think is the nicest one. And you can really see how distinctly it starts growing these lobes as the plant matures. Oops, looks like something has eaten it. I'm over here. I mean, they're still really nice actually. I do like them. This has been in the greenhouse since day dot actually, and it's growing well, but I have no desire to mature it further. So really when it reaches the top, I usually just take a cutting. You can see the recent cuttings over here, and I propagate it again. Or what I've done once is like once it reached the top, I actually chopped it into many single node cuttings and then ended up having like 20 Syngoniums that I started on a new pole that I then gave away because I had too many and so on. So yeah, again, despite growing it vertically, I'm not necessarily aiming for maturity over here. I'm not planning on extending this again to give the plant more height to actually mature. I'd rather aim for a lush pole full of juvenile leaves instead. But it's a good example over here as well. You can see Syngoniums root very vigorously. They have really good roots going into the pole everywhere. Lots and lots of aerial roots that you can redirect into the pole. And also based on my propagation success with the mojito, I propagated all of them in just water and had literally no casualties at all. So if you ever have an unrooted Syngonium cutting in just water is perfectly fine. They're really, really easygoing and they root really easily and quickly. So they're a great plant to propagate. At least from all of the ones I tried. There's so many varieties. I'm sure some varieties might be a little bit harder than others, but most of them that are kind of commercially available should be pretty easy. Alrighty, let's move on to a different type. This one is Syngonium Red Arrow, also called erythrophyllum, something like that. Based on the beautiful red becks that it's spotting over here. You can definitely still see the aphid damage. See all of these deformed leaves over here. That was with aphid damage, and then I managed to get rid of them. To be honest, I couldn't even tell you what it's called that I used. It just said against aphids. I was at Bunnings and I just went through the aisle and it said this one's against aphids. I took it and I sprayed it and it worked. It's actually the first time I've ever had aphids on a plant. Yeah, anyway. But you can see over here, this is what these leaves are supposed to look like. I can show you a video from last year when this one was really thriving. It was just hanging in my greenhouse. So in the greenhouse, obviously, it's exposed to very tropical conditions and it was thriving. After the aphids, I did not want the aphids to spread throughout the entire greenhouse. I actually took it out of the greenhouse and it's now just in my garden hanging on the fence. It likes it there as well, despite it being not as humid as in the greenhouse. I chose this one because I think this one makes a great trailing plant. It grows very compact, doesn't have super long internodal spacing. Sometimes with the podophyllums, I feel like the internodal spacing is a little bit lengthy, so I think this one has much shorter internodal spacing, makes a great trailing pot, and that's exactly what I needed in my greenhouse. I wanted to have something coming from above, and that one I thought was such a great candidate because it has the beautiful red backs, so when it's hanging you actually can really appreciate the front and the back. But apart from that, I don't have all too much to say about this plant. I've only grown this plant for a year and a half and I already had to give it a fundamental setback after 1 year because of the aphids, and now I'm slowly recovering it. So look, I haven't made all too much experience, but I also didn't try super hard in growing this in the first place. It kind of just did its own thing. And then we've got Syngonium macrophyllum. Similar to podophyllum, macrophyllum also has a few varieties, and this one is the frosted heart variety. Let me bring you closer. You can really see that when these leaves come out, they have this nice little frosted variegation, right? Almost looks like a little cupcake. They're much thicker and more leathery and have a distinctly different shape to the podophyllums as well. Now, I do believe these can actually grow quite mature, and I think you would need to give it really, really good tropical conditions to actually get there. This is currently in my greenhouse. It doesn't get a whole lot of light. It's actually more in a corner. But from a temperature and humidity perspective, you can't really get any closer to tropical conditions, and it's still not really sizing up, right? So I don't know to what extent you could really size this up within a pot and a pole. Maybe you would have a better time sizing up if I would plant this in the ground, but I don't really want it to size up in the first place. I'm just saying it's possible, but very unlikely within an indoor setting at least, which makes it such a good houseplant. It stays so nice and compact. This plant is like a year and a half old now. It started off as a tiny plant, right? Actually just a single node cutting it started off with, and I've done a full plant spotlight on this as well if you want to learn more about this specific species. Because it is such a slow grower, it stays quite nice and compact. It has short petioles, so it doesn't take up much space. It is a great plant for an indoor setting if you don't have a lot of space available, if you don't want to do very frequent chop and extends or extensions and repots and so on. Of course, they also exist in non-variegated and so on. They also look very similar to chia pansy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but apparently they're different from what I've seen. And who would have guessed? This one is my favorite. This one is Syngonium steiermarkii. Bring you a bit closer. Look at those. and have a look at the leaves at the bottom over here. This one. You can very much see how this plant changes its leaf shape a lot with maturity, and this is definitely my favorite Syngonium of all time. Easy to see why. As much as I spoke about keeping Syngoniums juvenile, I don't think that applies to the Styromarkii. I actually really like the mature leaves of this plant, and I've had such an easy time growing it over here. I am actually doing a full video on this plant that's hopefully coming up eventually on my channel. I tried to grow this indoors for over a year, and it actually had a lot of spider mite issues. I was just not really able to stay on top of the spider mites and provide it with the conditions that it wanted. But as soon as I put it outside, oh my god, it is loving it out there. And I put it outside at the beginning of spring, and it was out there over all of summer as well. So despite this being a high altitude plant, it even survived the 41-degree hot days out there without even burning. Now, it is not in direct sun, which is a good thing, otherwise I think it would burn, but comes back to the fact that I feel like Syngoniums have an easy time adjusting to whatever conditions you give it. Are they always going to thrive to their full potential no matter what conditions you give them? No. But are they going to survive and kind of be somewhat rewarding? Yes, I think so. Syngoniums is a plant that's often even used in offices, right? In office displays, in really dark rooms where you don't have much light, and they still survive. They're going to grow with large internodal spacing, and they're going to grow small leaves, but they're still going to grow. I think overall, Syngoniums is just a genus that is very, very forgiving. Oh, you forgot to water it? It's okay. It's not that finicky. Oh, the conditions aren't perfect? That's okay. It's still gonna survive. Oh, you had to propagate it? Don't worry. It's gonna grow a ginormous, really healthy root system really quickly, right? I think it's just a very forgiving genus within the aeroid family. So if you're new to growing aeroids, if you're new to growing on moss pods, if you're new to propagation and so on, I think Syngoniums are great plants to make lessons with, to make learnings with, because they are a little more forgiving. So you can actually focus on perfecting your craft and perfecting your conditions without having so many setbacks and so many question marks as to, oh my god, is it me? Is it the conditions? Is it the plant? What's going on? It is just going to be a more rewarding journey. And then you can take those learnings and maybe dabble into a few more tricky genuses like anthuriums and so on. At least those are my experiences, but obviously my experiences are heavily based on me also living in Sydney. I haven't grown plants outside of Sydney before, so I don't know how hard of a time I would have growing Syngoniums somewhere different. But as I mentioned before, if they can survive Sydney winter out there, they can definitely survive in somebody's house, wherever you are, as long as you heat it for your own sake and provide some light. Maybe that's the part where you guys come in. Let me know in the comment section down below. How do you feel about Syngoniums? What's your favorite Syngonium? What are your experiences? Are you having a good time? Are they tricky for you, or are they easy? If you got them indoors or outdoors, whereabouts in the world are you? Let's use the comment section down below as like a little community meetup to exchange our experience and knowledge around Syngoniums, and I'm really appreciative to anybody who wants to participate in that. Also, make sure you give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. You might think you're subscribed and turns out you're not. Also, ensure to turn on the bell notification. I've had many comments recently from people saying that, oh, we weren't suggested your videos in many months or many weeks, or where have you been? We haven't seen a video of you. I upload 3 videos a week consistently. So if you're not showing my videos, it's not because I'm not uploading, it's because the algorithm is doing us dirty. But the best way to go about it is turning on the bell notification. That way you get a notification every time I upload, so you're not missing any of my videos. In advance, thank you so much, but it's time to say goodbye and happy growing.